First. I'm Armanda Famiglietti. Midterm elections are just around the corner, and tonight my guest is running for the Assembly District 94. His name is Vedat Gashi. He's a Democrat, and he'll also be on the Independence line. And I want to thank him very much for coming back for another interview. Thanks, Vedat.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Vedat, I know you've been really busy lately, so thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk with us. So tell me about yourself and why you think people should vote for you.
That's a big question. First off, I wanted to say that I'm going to be on the Democratic line, also on the Independence line, but also the Working Families and the Women's Equality line as well.
Terrific.
So we have 4 lines. I am a Yorktown resident. I grew up in Yorktown and went to Lakeland High School. And I'm a father of 2. I have a small business. After graduating from Lakeland High School, I went to, I interned for Judge Sotomayor and Lee Hamilton, and then eventually worked for the United Nations, where I helped draft laws. Eventually, we came back to raise my kids in the same community that I grew up in, and at some point I decided to run for office. That's the thumbnail about who I am. Yeah, I'm excited to be here because, frankly, even though it is a busy time, the most important thing I can be doing is talking to potential voters, and thank you for the opportunity to reach out to so many.
So, what do you think are the main reasons why people should vote for you and not your opponent?
Well, I make the argument that this is my first political campaign, and I make the argument that, and I think part of the reason why I got the Independence Party, that we're in a pretty hyper-partisan, nasty time right now. And I think people are tired of it. We have real problems, and I always say, don't talk to me about Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell. Talk to me about how it actually impacts the people here. And in this district, there are a lot of people who are tired of the people that get outraged the fastest. And I think there are a lot of people closer to the middle. And that's what I think I have to offer. My question isn't what is the party line or the ideology specifically. My question is, how does it impact me and my family? How does it impact my community? So I'm informed by the fact that I have kids. So when we talk about guns or the safety of our children and the environment, I think about my children.
School funding.
School funding. Roads, I think about me and my family, the drive that I have to do it. And obviously, I have a child of a small business family, and as the owner of a small business, again, I think about taxes and how it impacts not only business, but also homeowners. And here there's some real serious questions we need to answer. And I think we answer those serious questions by looking at a common sense, looking at it in a common sense way, thinking about how it actually impacts us rather than what the party line is. My opponent was rated the #1 most conservative member of the Assembly by the New York Conservative Party. And I get it. There are conservative members of my community, but we represent a large community that includes both conservatives and liberals and a lot of people right in the middle. And my goal would be to represent the entire community, not just a segment of it. And I think that makes the most sense in terms of representation, but it also is useful because I think having a partisan approach will sometimes lead you to kind of absurd results. One of them was on this vote for on guns. I always like to say that, well, I'm a gun owner and I believe in the right to bear arms, but at the same time there was a bill about whether convicted domestic abusers should have access to guns. That was the only purpose of the bill, and it was convicted domestic abusers. And he voted that they should. He voted.
Well, wait a minute. He voted that they should be able to own guns.
He voted against the bill that would deprive them of guns.
Okay.
And to me, that's an absurd result. I haven't spoken to a person yet who thinks that convicted domestic abusers should have access to guns. And again, you know, I have a daughter, a wife, a sister, and a mother. These are, to me, I think about common sense. How does it impact me and our community rather than what's the party line or what's the special interest line on an issue? And I think that's resonated really well. I'm really encouraged that when I go, I've been knocking on doors every single day. And when I knock on these doors, people love to hear that. And actually yesterday, this woman, Linda, said to me, she said, you know, I've always voted Republican, but this time I'm going to be voting for you, and just please keep that common sense approach.
Oh, great.
And I think it's easy for me to, because I'm capable of, I'm an attorney, I work for the United Nations, I'm capable of complicated thoughts and complicated ways to attack it. But a lot of these questions are really simple. They're common sense approaches. And if there's a bill about whether convicted domestic abusers should have access to guns, the answer to that is no. And also, and probably most importantly for a lot of the people I speak to in this district, taxes. There's a state and local tax deduction under the federal bill. There was a New York State response to that. And
well, there was a limit on how much you can deduct your state and local taxes, a limit of only $10,000, and I would say not that many people in your district pay less or even $10,000 in state and local taxes, mostly more.
Well, that's very fair.
Much more.
Yeah, that's very fair. And I think we can start off the comment by saying, yes, there are people that pay less than $10,000 in taxes, in state and local taxes, and if you do, you're not going to be impacted by this law. A lot of the people that I deal with, almost every person that I've dealt with so far, every door that I've knocked on so far, has told me that it would impact them. I could tell you that it would impact me.
I can tell you it would impact me.
Yes. And it's such a, in our district where we pay the highest taxes in the country, Westchester and Putnam, but Westchester especially, we're going to be hurt by that. So if there's a question about lowering that tax, I would think that you side with our community rather than the party line. And I think on this one, my opponent voted against the bill that contained that. And that's why it's funny, because in our first interview, I'd made the statement in relation to the state and local tax deduction limit that as the Republican, you would think that he'd vote to lower our taxes, but he hasn't. And he took offense to that, and he brought up a charge before the Fair Campaigns Practices Committee. And I was glad that the Fair Campaigns Practices Committee declined to find that it was unfair. And the reason they did is because the state and local tax deduction would have the benefit of lowering our taxes, and he voted against it. In relation to that specific bill, he voted the other way. And again, there are nuances. You can say, like, it certainly won't impact everybody. And a thing that I've heard on the other side is, well, he's voted against every tax increase. The sorts of tax increases, yes, he had brought up that he voted against a 5-cent fee for plastic bags in New York City. And he said that that was a tax decision that he'd made. And I said, that may well be true, but that has much lesser impact for us than the taxes here. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in our previous interview, the question is not only lowering our taxes, but since we pay so much in taxes, getting a fair share of what we pay. And I think right now we're underrepresented because the incumbent is voting against the voting with the conservative line more than every other member of the assembly. That's why he was his votes are what earned him the #1 most conservative member of the assembly. And he argues that he's not in the room, and I agree with him. He's not in the room, and that's why.
What does that mean? He's not in the room.
Well, he discusses during the budgeting process. The minority conference isn't involved in the.
Okay, I see.
And he argues that he's not in the room when those decisions are made. And again, I agree, he's not. And I think for that reason, it's incumbent and helpful for the members here that if you have somebody in the majority and somebody who can make a forceful argument about how it impacts us here. And I think I can do that.
So you're saying because he's a Republican and following the Republican doctrine to the letter, I'm trying to understand what you're saying, that therefore he's not in with the majority party who's making the rules because they are the majority party, but electing you, who is a member of the majority party, you'd have more of a voice for the 94th district.
I think that's correct. I think also, in addition to being within the majority party, my background is, again, a small business owner of a community that's diverse and has a lot of Republicans in it. I have family members that are Republican and conservative. And in these rallies, these events that we'll have, a lot of the times there'll be as many Republicans in the crowd as there'll be Democrats. There are some Democrats that'll say, I have a hard time being friends with the Republican, but that's not true of me. I have family members that are Republican. I'm a proud Democrat, but I think the reason I got the Independence Party, again, is because I have an ability and willingness to hear both sides and come up with, again, not what the party line to an answer to a question is, but what the best answer for our community is. And I think people want to hear that. I want to hear that. Yeah. So we have serious problems. We do, we do. And I don't always feel represented by your opponent because he does take such a strong conservative line. And that doesn't represent my thinking or my family's thinking. And I'd say I'm more, to you, more of a centrist, that some things make sense, some things don't. But look at each issue in terms of whether it makes sense or not, and not what your party is, how your party is telling you to vote. So one more thing, you're a very modest man, and when you talked about your background, you kind of went by a few things that stood out to me as qualifications that I'm sure your opponent doesn't have. One of them was that you clerked for Justice Sotomayor before she was a justice, on her way up in her career. So I just want to take a moment and say, what was that like? I mean, she seems like she's a remarkable human being. Right. I was a summer clerk and intern for Judge Sotomayor when she was in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals before she went to the Supreme Court. It was a fantastic opportunity to be one of the highest courts of the land. It was a privilege and an honor to get that opportunity. Even before she became a Supreme Court justice, she was a very well-known and influential judge. She is brilliant. She is hard-nosed, and I think I use that as a guidepost for myself sometimes. She worked harder or as hard as any one of her employees or clerks, and she came in early and left late, and those are the sorts of, let's say, values that I hope to emulate. And I think she is and she showed it even through her confirmation hearings and now as the Supreme Court Justice. She's a fantastic representative of America, really. She grew up in poverty in the Bronx, as I did. So I again was excited about that. But she's a person who grew up without the privilege and access that maybe some others will have.
Well, let me interrupt
Sure.
you because just recently there was quite a to-do about the nomination and confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, and you worked for Sotomayor, who would be an example of what you'd want to see in the Supreme Court, at least what I'd want to see. And then you had that spectacle of Brett Kavanaugh crying, being disrespectful to senators. I'm going to say maybe telling untruths under oath about what the meaning of certain words and characterizations of him as not being I don't know what the word is, under the influence as maybe he was. What did you make when you, after working with Sotomayor, what did you make of that?
Well, in particular relation to Judge Sotomayor, I recall during her confirmations that there was an allegation that her temperament was perhaps not suited at that time. And I thought she maintained herself with wonderful composure during that process. The Brett Kavanaugh, you describe it as a spectacle, and I think that's fair. And I think actually, to be fair, both Democrats and Republicans have some responsibility here. It's become, again, this nasty partisan position where a lot of Democrats were opposed to Kavanaugh from the moment he was mentioned before these very serious and troubling allegations came up. It creates a problem because if you were against him from the start, then it makes less believable your complaints when the true ones or serious ones bubble up. I think those allegations could have stood to be scrutinized a bit better, but also, as you mentioned, under oath he answered some questions about the yearbook quotes and things along those lines, which may be minor in the grand scheme of things.
Well, definitions of certain terms that I hadn't heard of before the hearings.
Right.
But he gave definitions that were not in line with the popular understanding of what those terms were. And that just shocked me that a judge, he is a sitting federal judge at the time of that hearing, that he would actually say things that were provably
false.
I'm going to say false.
Yeah,
or
they were provably false.
Under oath. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Well, and listen, he is a very accomplished man. He's a judge in a federal court. He's a wonderful resume. I disagree with the way he handled it, maybe from the start. I think were it me, I would acknowledge that, yes, when I was 16 and I might have written or said something else, I thought that would be a more honest way to tackle it. He chose to deny certain things and, frankly, misrepresent other positions. And this is about the highest, absent the president. This is a lifetime appointment, unique in our governmental system, and a real privilege, and he seems to have thought that he was entitled to it. For a lifetime appointment, I was disappointed with the way he handled it, and frankly, I think in a less partisan time, where people were sitting back and objectively looking at it, they might have decided a person who has seemingly verifiable mistruths, let's say, on the stand is perhaps not the choice you would make.
Yeah.
But we're in this hyper-partisan thing where Democrats were outraged immediately and the Republicans immediately went on the defensive. And again, it's this nasty, hyper-partisan, extreme right-wing or extreme left-wing, who could be the loudest and most outraged first, that leads us to some conclusions that the middle kind of just shakes their head at and says, what are you doing? That federal situation gets mimicked locally a lot. we'll see nasty and untrue things.
I think the timing as well, because here we are so close to a midterm election, which is being touted as maybe the most important midterm election that we've had in decades. November 6th, go out and vote. And so I think some of that partisanship was really raising its ugly head because everybody was playing to the people they hope are going to come out and vote to them back in their hometowns and their home states. And I think, like you say, it translates from that level down to the local level and to the New York Assembly and the Senate, which up until recently, well, actually, the present certainly, it's very divided along partisan lines. And what is that? What happens? Nothing gets done, right?
Yeah.
So if you go to the Assembly, what will you do to try to remedy that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think you do that by accepting that, well, for example, I'm a Democrat, and I've got the Independence Party, the Working Families Party, and the Women's Equality backing. But if elected, I don't represent just the Democrats or just the independent people. I represent my whole community, and I recognize that my community is diverse. I think this, again, nasty, I think is, I'm comfortable calling it nasty. National situation has seeped into our local politics. And I try not to get caught up in that. We have serious questions, and it's time for a serious response to that. It's time for some adults in the room. I'd been asked about Cynthia Nixon, and I thought there's people who love her and people who hated her, but all I really knew about her was that she was an actress of a show that I didn't really watch. And I said, she might be wonderful, but it's time for some serious responses to these super serious questions. And I talk about it, and borrowing from a business background, I would say, let's say you're going to buy a house from somebody. The first question you ask them isn't, what political party are you in? I think it might be the last question you ask them.
Right.
Because it doesn't lead you to an answer.
It isn't, it doesn't pertain to what the issue is at the moment, which is buying a house.
Yeah, and again, going back to that common sense approach, I'm guided by, when we're talking about the environment or gun safety in schools, I think about my children. And I joke that one of the great benefits to running for a local office is that I've been paying less attention to the national back and forth, paying more attention to the local. But when the Parkland shootings happened in Florida, I have two young kids. I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, both in Yorktown schools. It's impossible to ignore that. And the day after the Parkland shooting, I got a text message, an email, and a phone call from Brookside School saying that the school was in lockdown because there was suspicious activity in the home across the street from the school.
Frightening.
That's a moment where the heart comes to the, to your throat, and you can't ignore that. And again, I'm more informed by my position as a father on these issues than I am by any special interest, frankly. And similarly, if I'm paying taxes, I'm a homeowner. I pay taxes. I'm a member of this community, so the things that better this community impact me. So
I just want to interrupt you because we're moving along. We're running out of time, and I want to mention that you're going to be at the Candidates Forum that's being sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Putnam County and Mahopac Library on Monday, the 22nd of October. Starts at 6:30. You're going to be able to talk as well as your opponent and several other candidates who are running for office. And is this going to be the first time you're going to actually be talking in the same room with your opponent, or have you had other debates or forums before?
This will be our first debate and proper forum. We were recently at the Putnam County Chamber of Commerce, where we both delivered 2-minute presentations in the same room. But otherwise, yeah, it'll be the first time we'll, I think, meaningfully interact in public. Yeah. Yeah,
that's great, because you're a newcomer to local politics anyways, even though you have this remarkable background at much higher levels. And so people should come out and get to know you and meet you and talk to you. And I know that you said you've been knocking on doors all over the place. Do you feel that there is, we talked about this before the show, a real enthusiasm and energy that makes this particular election a little more, I don't know, vibrant and exciting for a midterm election?
Well, the door knocking, I think I found a wonderful ability. Oh yeah, the door knocking has been great. But also at the rallies we have, the events that we put together, the town halls and those sorts of things, it's been wonderful attendance at these events. People are excited and inspired. I am encouraged by the number of people that are registering to vote. And yeah, when you knock on doors, there has been a wonderful response and enthusiasm. And people tell you, I'm voting for you, or don't worry, I'm going out there, and I say, you know, thank you. Yeah. But it's been the people say, you know, running for office is hard, and there are a lot of things to do, but it's fantastic. You get to interact and connect with people, and it's been a wonderful response, a receptive audience. People want a serious and reasoned approach to these problems.
Well,
and
I certainly do.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for running, Vedat. Thanks for coming on the
show.
Good luck on November 6th. I'll be there to see you at the Candidates Forum at the Mahopac Library on the 22nd. And thanks to the terrific crew who come in all the time and are so helpful. And they're all volunteers. And thanks for you for watching.